Louis XIV rarely tried to hide his many affairs from the court, but one was so scandalous he had no choice. Known as the Sun King, Louis XIV ruled France for an astonishing 72 years. He came to symbolize the grandeur, glamour, and magnetic pomp of the French monarchy at its height. But behind the lavish parties and towering wigs lay a darker history filled with intrigue, scandal, decadence, war, fashion, and even more scandal. Louis XIV's mother, Anne of Austria, was 37 when she gave birth to him, after suffering 4 stillbirths. His improbable survival led Anne and others to believe that God had destined Louis to flourish and rule. Then came a surprise. Anne gave birth to another healthy son soon after. Since she and her husband, King Louis XIII, believed Louis XIV was fated for the throne, and devised a plan to prevent any rivalry between the brothers. She encouraged the younger son, Philippe, to wear girls' clothing and pursue more traditionally feminine activities, hoping this would steer him away from the military sphere and from ever challenging his brother. Did it prevent sibling rivalry? Yes. Did it affect Philippe in other ways? Absolutely. When King Louis XIII died, Anne became regent for the young Louis XIV. As regent, she had to balance competing court factions, often at great personal risk. She made controversial decisions to consolidate power for her son, moves that enraged the feudal French aristocracy. These tensions sparked a series of civil uprisings known as the Frondes, which put Anne and Louis in grave danger. One night, rebels stormed the palace and demanded to see the king. They entered Louis's bedchamber, where the terrified boy pretended to be asleep. Thankfully, it worked. They left without harming him, but the incident forced Anne and Louis to flee Paris in fear for their lives. The trauma of rebellion left a lasting mark on the young king. It ended his carefree childhood and planted a deep mistrust and even hatred of the Paris court and nobility. That experience would shape the entire course of his reign. Louis reached the age of majority in 1651, shortly after his 13th birthday. Now that her son held full power as King of France, Anne of Austria set her sights on achieving peace with Spain, and she had a plan. To modernize, Louis XIV's wedding to Maria Theresa, the daughter of the King of Spain, might seem bizarre. First, there was a marriage by proxy in Spain, where a stand-in took the groom's place beside Maria Theresa. A lavish ceremony followed in France, complete with plans for a traditional public consummation. Yes, tradition dictated that the royal couple would consummate their marriage in front of witnesses. Thankfully, Anne arranged for it to happen in private instead. It was unusual for a foreign queen to have her mother-in-law's support, but Anne took to Maria Theresa right away. She understood how hard it was to be an outsider at the French court, and, as it happened, she was also Maria Theresa's aunt. This family dynamic kept Louis XIV on his toes. The Sun King, however, was far from faithful. He tried to keep his affairs discreet, but Louis XIV was both a prolific lover and a prolific father. Historians estimate he had around 22 children, legitimate and illegitimate, with various women. His first child was with a palace gardener, though his tastes in lovers became more refined over time. He began a long-term affair with Louise de Valier, a lady-in-waiting to his brother's wife. But it wasn't just desire that led him to her. Louis' brother had recently married Henrietta of England. When the pair entered court life, people noticed the king's close relationship with Henrietta, and dark rumors took off. To quiet the gossip, Louise and Henrietta came up with a clever plan. She would introduce him to 3 of her ladies-in-waiting, and he'd choose one to publicly flirt with. Naturally, he picked Louise de Laye. The plan worked a little too well. He fell for her. Louise was bright, talented, and, most importantly, seemed to like Louis for who he was, not for his power or wealth. His marriage had been a political match, so it made sense he'd crave something more romantic. What's wild is that he had time for romance at all, given what he had in store for France. Louis had grown up watching ministers and members of the parliament, Deary, fight for control over the monarchy. So when he came to power, he did something radical. He declared he would rule without a chief minister. Every government official would answer directly to the king. No middleman. The real question was whether the people would accept such a bold move. After years of chaos and instability, it turns out they did. France was ready for a decisive, powerful ruler. Despite his many affairs, Louis XIV was still fulfilling his duties in the royal bedchamber. Maria Theresa became pregnant in 1661 and gave birth to a son that November, fulfilling every newlywed king's dream. They named the brand new heir to the throne Louis. What else? Although his affair with Louise de la Vallière was an open secret, Maria Theresa remained blissfully unaware, or at least pretended to be. In fact, Maria Theresa seemed blissfully unaware of just about everything around her. Aside from the occasional pregnancy, the Queen showed little interest in the typical duties expected of her. She much preferred playing cards and gambling with her friends, which was perfectly fine with Louis XIV. There was no love lost between Louis and his wife, and their marriage was further strained by the issue of her unpaid dowry. While Maria Theresa mourned the death of her father, Louis XIV was busy scrutinizing the fine print of their marriage contract. Citing the unpaid dowry as justification, he seized Spanish territory and began maneuvering to place a member of his own family on the Spanish throne. This would have some serious consequences down the line. Awkwardly, both Maria Theresa and Louise de la Vallière became pregnant at the same time. With the two women in his life occupied, Louis XIV's eyes started to wander. That's when Madame de Montespan saw her opportunity. She seduced the king and quickly won his full attention. Louise de la Vallière soon realized what was happening. Devastated, she took desperate steps to win the king back. While still pregnant, she traveled without authorization to the battlefield where Louis was leading a campaign. There she threw herself at his feet. Louis XIV sent her away. Louise returned to court where Madame de Montespan had already mocked her mercilessly to the other courtiers. When Louis returned, he made it clear de Montespan was his new favorite. She held enormous influence at court, so much so that people began calling her the false Queen of France. In the 1660s, Louis XIV decided to transform an old hunting lodge into a grand palatial estate. The project was more of a political move than anything else. It would become a massive symbol of his power, especially over the nobility of Paris. The king wanted the nobles to come to him on his turf. If a French nobleman wanted to make money or gain any sort of favor with the king, they had to haul themselves to Versailles. It was the center of power, where courtiers arranged marriages, sought employment, and vied for attention, all under the ever-watchful eye of Louis XIV. No wonder he called himself the Sun King. He expected the world to revolve around him, and at Versailles it actually did. It's not like life at Versailles was boring. There was hunting, entertainment, gambling, food, and drink. No one could say no to the luxurious lifestyle Louis provided. Before this centralization, nobles from the countryside would gather private armies and stir up local conflicts. Louis XIV put a stop to all that, turning France's military focus outward instead. From 1667 to 1697, the French armed forces ballooned from 30,000 to 400,000 men. But this increase in power and territory had an unfortunate side effect that united many of Louis's enemies against him. And while Louis was focused on cementing France's place as the dominant power in Europe, there were still problems at home he couldn't ignore. In July of 1683, Queen Maria Theresa fell gravely ill. When Louis XIV saw how bad it was, he prepared for the worst. Within a week, she succumbed to her illness, and her passing was painful. Their marriage had been distant, but Maria Theresa had been a good match. She had given him what many queens failed to an heir. Louis XIV's relationship with his heir and namesake Louis the Grand Dauphin was cold and distant. The king viewed his son with suspicion, and the boy's tutor wasn't much kinder. He compared the Grand Dauphin to Queen Maria Theresa, essentially saying both were dumb and harmless. After his wife's death, Louis XIV secretly married Madame de Maintenon, a close friend of Madame de Montespan, who had been put in charge of raising his illegitimate children. From this point on, as far as historians can tell, Louis stopped having mistresses entirely. But how did Madame de Maintenon manage to steal the king's attention from his longtime mistress, Madame de Montespan? In 1677, a scandal rocked Louis XIV's court. The king became interested in the young and beautiful Duchess of Fontaine, who died suddenly, not long after. Rumors swirled that Madame de Montespan had poisoned her. This led into a full-blown panic known as the Affair of the Poisons, where nobles were accused of murder, witchcraft, and black magic. Montespan found herself at the center of it all, accused of using dark rituals to keep the king's love. Nothing was ever proven, but the damage was done. Disgusted by the scandal and chaos, Louis turned away from Montespan and turned toward the more calm, devout Madame de Maintenon. Maintenon came from humble beginnings. Her father had been a prisoner, and her mother was the daughter of a prison director. Scandalous. Because of this lowly background, the king could never formally marry her, meaning she would never become queen, and their union would never be officially recognized. Still, Madame de Maintenon found a way to leave her mark. She had tremendous influence over the king and became a trusted advisor. It was by all accounts the healthiest and most equal relationship Louis had ever had, and considering the storm on the horizon, having a sharp, steady ally was exactly what he needed. France's enemies were uniting again, forming an alliance so grand it was called the Grand Alliance. This time the list of opponents was long. England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Portugal, and Savoy. In short, it was France versus nearly all of Europe. The 9 Years' War began in 1688, and Louis XIV wasted no time striking back. His armies met the enemy on battlefields across the continent, while he and his ministers worked behind the scenes to dismantle the Grand Alliance from within. France won several key battles, but after years of fighting, the cost was steep. Exhausted and nearly broke, France eventually made peace, keeping some crucial territories, but at a high price. Louis XIV was eager to avoid further conflict, but he also had something else on his mind. King Charles II of Spain was childless and dying. Years earlier, Louis had exploited an unpaid debt to ensure that his grandson, Philippe of Anjou, would be in the line of succession for the Spanish throne. Technically, Charles II had agreed to name Philip of Anjou as his heir. But the problem was massive. If the French royal family suddenly controlled both France and Spain, it would totally disrupt the balance of power in Europe. So, the Grand Alliance formed once again, this time to take on both France and Spain. The War of the Spanish Succession was longer and far more grueling than the war that came before it, but France and Spain proved to be tough opponents. Ultimately, France and Spain agreed to a permanent separation to end the conflict. Louis XIV lost his grip on Spain, but his grandson still got to keep the throne. At 76 years old, Louis turned his attention to his legacy. Throughout his reign, Louis XIV had been a devoted patron of the arts, and under his rule, France experienced a cultural renaissance. One of his greatest passions, dance. He didn't just love ballet, he performed it. Louis appeared in more than 40 major ballets, playing around 80 roles. That's a resume that rivals even some professional dancers. But Louis didn't only want applause on stage. He wanted to be remembered visually and gloriously. He commissioned more than 300 formal portraits of himself, each one portraying him with regal authority or divine symbolism. His obsession with his image didn't stop at paintings. Louis had an enormous wardrobe of extravagant clothing, shoes, and towering wigs, all crafted to make him appear larger than life. With his high heels and wigs on, he stood over 6 feet tall. In reality, he was just 5'4". And yet, behind all the grandeur, a mystery lingered. In the mid-9th century, writer Alexandre Dumas published The Man in the Iron Mask, a novel based on a real figure, a mysterious prisoner kept in various French jails for 34 years. His identity was never confirmed, but speculation ran wild, and much of it pointed directly to Louis XIV. Philosopher Voltaire claimed the masked man was the king's illegitimate half-brother. Others believed the prisoner was something even more scandalous, Louis XIV's secret twin. The theory went like this. Since the royal family had a history of twins, Louis XIII and Anne of Austria had hidden the younger sibling to avoid a succession crisis. When the boy eventually learned the truth and tried to claim the throne, he was imprisoned and forced to wear an iron mask to conceal his resemblance to the king. Historians have debated the story for centuries, but the whispers followed Louis XIV for the rest of his life. There was yet another rumor that clung to him until the end. When his brother Philip's first wife, Henrietta, arrived at court, gossip claimed that Louis had an affair with her. Some even believed that he, not Philip, had fathered her daughter, Marie-Louise. Even the Sun King couldn't escape mortality. Though he seemed invincible, Louis XIV battled numerous health issues throughout his life. In 1711, his son and heir, the Grand Dan, died suddenly. His next best option was his grandson, Philip. But Philip had already renounced his claim to the French throne to rule Spain. That left Louis's great-grandson. And if you can believe it, the boy's name was, you guessed it, Louis. The child was only 5, but with no other viable heirs, the aging king began preparing him for the crown. In the summer of 1715, Louis XIV developed gangrene. It was a slow and agonizing decline, and on September 1st, just 4 days before his 77th birthday, he died at Versailles. His reign had lasted an astonishing 72 years, the longest of any monarch in history. Upon his death, the throne passed to his 5-year-old great-grandson, who became King Louis XV. Louis XIV left behind a powerful and complicated legacy. He transformed France into a cultural and military powerhouse. But his relentless ambition came at great cost. From scandal and war to opulence and innovation, his reign shaped Europe for generations. Even in death, the myth of the Sun King endured. Part man, part legend, and forever a symbol of absolute monarchy at its peak. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factate, for more incredible facts about everything.